This is my true story. I gave my life to build comfort for my family, but the one I trusted most betrayed me. My daughter told me plainly, "You're useless," and without a thought, she took my favorite chair. I felt a pain deeper than words. I never imagined my own child would treat me this way. That night I sat in silence, thinking of every year of sacrifice. I decided then I would answer not with anger, but with action. You won't believe what I did next. Before I continue, tell me where you're watching from, and please subscribe so my story reaches more people. I spent my life in service of my family. From the moment I earned my first wage, my thoughts were not of myself, but of the comfort and future of my children. Every sunrise was a promise I made to work harder, to endure longer, so they could live without fear of want. I worked in the cold mornings before the sun rose and came home when darkness had already settled, my body tired, my spirit tested, but my will unbroken. I carried burdens quietly, never speaking of the cost, because in my mind, this was not sacrifice, it was duty. I remember days when there was barely enough food for all, yet I would ensure my children ate before I touched a morsel. My coat was threadbare, my shoes worn to holes, but I never complained. I believed they could not feel my hardship if I bore it silently. I took pride in that. I gave up comforts, skipped meals, and worked double shifts so my children would know only warmth and abundance. To me, family was the measure of life's worth. I believed the walls we lived in, the roof above our heads, were built not only of brick and wood, but of years of labor and care. Every nail I hammered, every brick I laid, every hour of overtime I took was for them, a tangible expression of my devotion. I thought they would grow to understand, to value it, and to respect it. I thought my place in the home was secure. I thought my sacrifices would mean something. I thought love was enough. But as years passed, I began to notice changes. My children grew independent, and my role faded in their eyes. The respect I imagined was theirs by instinct began to slip away. I saw it not in sudden acts, but in small signs. A careless word, a dismissive glance, a decision made without regard for my presence. I brushed them aside, telling myself it was part of growing up. I endured quietly, as I had endured a lifetime of work. But silence does not heal wounds, and years of sacrifice can be overlooked if they are taken for granted. I came to realize that sacrifice alone does not guarantee respect. It must be nurtured by gratitude and acknowledgement. I learned that too late. My life was not built upon selfishness or ambition. It was built upon a promise that my children would never want, that they would always have a home and comfort. I worked without pause to keep that promise. I wanted them to see the value of a home, to see that it was more than walls and a roof. I wanted them to understand that respect grows where love is sustained by deeds. I believed respect was the natural return for a lifetime of care. I thought my place in the home was secure, as the head of the family, the pillar who should never be shaken. I thought my sacrifices would be honored, that my children would carry forward the same respect for life and family that I had carried for them. I was wrong. I discovered that respect can fade when it is not spoken, when gratitude is not expressed. I discovered that even the strongest foundation can be undermined if those who stand upon it forget the work that built it. I lived my life for them. I gave without counting cost. I sacrificed without complaint. And yet, one day, it seemed that my sacrifices were forgotten. I felt as though I was no longer part of the home I had built, no longer part of the family I had nourished. My name was no longer spoken with care, my counsel no longer sought. I began to feel invisible in the place I had given everything to. I felt the slow, painful erosion of what I thought was my role and my value. I knew that this was the price of silence, the hidden cost of bearing burdens alone. I thought I was protecting them, but perhaps I was protecting myself from confrontation. I thought I was teaching them humility by example, but perhaps I was teaching them to take without asking, to expect without giving. I can still remember sitting quietly one night, after everyone had gone to bed, feeling the weight of years pressing down on me. I thought of every early morning and every late night, of every sacrifice I had made without complaint. I thought of every moment I had worked to keep them safe, warm, and fed, and I asked myself if they saw any of that. I asked myself if it mattered to them at all. My heart ached with the answer. I began to see that my life of sacrifice, though given freely, had not been recognized. My place in their hearts had shifted, and I could not call it back by mere memory. I understood then that love without respect is incomplete, and sacrifice without acknowledgement can be invisible. I realized that my years of giving had shaped my identity, but they had not guaranteed my place in their lives. I had lived for them, but they no longer lived for me. That realization broke something inside me. It was not anger that came first, but sorrow. Deep, quiet sorrow that settled in my chest. I understood that this was a turning point. I could continue to give silently, letting my dignity erode, or I could act in a way that would remind them of what I had given and what they had taken. I began to think of what that action would look like. It would not be loud or full of bitterness. It would not be revenge in the way the world speaks of it. It would be a measured act, deliberate and undeniable. It would speak louder than words, louder than years of silence. I thought of my home, not as property, but as a symbol of my sacrifice. I thought of my life, not as an obligation, but as a testament to what I had given, and I decided that I would act. Not for anger, not for pride, but for truth. I wanted them to see, finally, the weight of what I had carried all my life. I wanted them to understand, without me saying it in argument, that respect is not given automatically. It is earned, preserved, and acknowledged. I wanted my life of sacrifice to be remembered, not dismissed. That is why I decided what I would do. I would make a choice that would stand as a quiet declaration of the years I had given. A choice that would speak without shouting, that would teach without fighting. I wanted my act to be my voice when my own words had been ignored, and in that resolve I found a strange peace. I did not yet know the form this choice would take, but I knew I would not remain silent forever. My life of sacrifice had brought me to this moment, and I was ready to let it be known. The signs began slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. I remember thinking it was nothing more than fatigue or stress. My daughter's tone when she spoke to me shifted. Her words became sharper, her patience shorter. What once was a gentle conversation over tea turned into curt replies and hurried exits from the room. She no longer asked about my day, nor did she listen to the stories I tried to share. My presence became something to tolerate rather than to cherish. At family dinners, her laughter no longer included me, and her eyes avoided mine. My son, too, followed this pattern. What had been respect turned into disregard. When I offered advice, he answered with a sharpness I had never heard before. My opinions were dismissed as outdated or irrelevant. The value of my years of experience seemed to evaporate with every passing day. I began to notice the subtle exclusion, decisions made without asking for my thoughts, gatherings planned without informing me, conversations held in rooms where I was not welcome. My presence at home felt less like a blessing and more like a burden. I tolerated these changes quietly. My years had taught me endurance. I told myself that time could heal these things, that perhaps my children were simply growing, asserting independence. I told myself they did not realize what they were doing. I told myself to wait. I wanted to believe that the love between us would return to the way it had once been. I kept my thoughts to myself, thinking silence might preserve the peace. I thought patience was my duty, even when my dignity was quietly being eroded. The change was not sudden, but cumulative. It was not marked by a single incident, but by countless small acts of disregard, invitations that I was never extended, requests for my opinion that were met with a shrug, the quiet laughter that fell when I entered a room. These signs piled upon each other until they became a mountain I could not ignore. I began to feel as if I no longer belonged in my own home. I began to wonder if my sacrifices, my years of work, meant anything at all to them. I recall sitting one evening at the dinner table, noticing how my daughter ignored my presence. Her phone lay between us, and she spoke more to it than to me. My son joined her in conversation but avoided looking at me. I felt the weight of invisibility pressing down. I asked myself how respect could fade so quietly, without a word of explanation. I wondered if it was my fault, if silence had been the wrong choice. I wondered if I had failed to teach them the value of respect. And yet, I knew in my heart that my silence had been my strength, not my weakness. Respect, I realized, was not something that could be assumed. It must be shown in actions every day. It must be nurtured through acknowledgement and care. My children's disregard was not simply a matter of words or tone. It was a rejection of the foundation we had built together. It was a quiet dismissal of everything I had done for them. That realization was painful. It made me reflect on the years I had worked without rest to give them comfort, and how easily that work was now being overlooked. I began to understand that patience alone would not restore what had been lost. I remember another moment, standing quietly in the hallway, overhearing a conversation between my daughter and her friends. They spoke of me as though I were invisible, as though I did not matter. They laughed softly, but their laughter was sharp and cutting. They spoke of me as old and useless, words that cut deeper than any insult. I stepped away quietly, my hands trembling. That night, I could not sleep. I thought of all the years I had given, of every brick laid, every hour worked, every sacrifice made. I thought of how easily those years could be forgotten when respect was not present. The signs of disrespect grew bolder. My daughter began to take liberties in ways she never had before. She would move my belongings without asking, change things in the home I had built, and speak of my efforts as though they were trivial. My son, too, began to treat my presence as a disruption rather than a blessing. They spoke loudly in my absence, forgetting that I could hear. They made plans without consulting me, as if my voice no longer mattered. I began to understand that respect was not something they thought they owed me. It was something they no longer recognized as part of our bond. I endured quietly at first, because my nature was to give without demanding return. I believed that time and example would bring them back to respect. But as the days turned into months, I saw that respect was slipping further away. My voice was silenced by habit, my presence ignored by choice. I began to feel the ache of invisibility, a wound deeper than any argument, because it was silent and constant. I knew that something had to change, that patience had been exhausted. I knew that this pattern could not continue without leaving a wound that would never heal. By then, the signs were unmistakable. Disrespect had become the norm. It was no longer hidden in small moments, but worn openly, as if it were a badge of triumph. My place at the table was ignored, my words overlooked, my sacrifices forgotten. I realized then that the issue was not just about me being respected, but about my children losing sight of the value of what had been given to them. That realization gave me clarity. I knew that patience was no longer enough. I knew that if nothing was done, the bond between us would break entirely. I began to think of what must be done. It could not be shouted in anger or pleaded in sorrow. It had to be something deliberate, something that would speak without raising my voice. I needed an act that would convey the truth of my sacrifice and the pain of being disregarded. I wanted them to see what had been taken for granted. I wanted them to understand that respect is built over years and can be lost in a moment. I wanted them to remember the father who worked quietly for them and why that work deserved honor. Those signs of disrespect became my turning point. They were not merely words or actions. They were the proof that something deeper was broken. My silence, my endurance, had not restored respect. It had allowed it to erode. I could not stand by and let the home I had built, the family I had nurtured, be torn apart by disregard. I resolved then to act, not with anger, but with resolve, not with noise, but with purpose. I would speak through action. I would teach them a lesson they could not ignore. That was the moment I decided that my story would change. My voice would be heard without shouting. My presence would be felt without confrontation. I knew then that the next step I took would not be small, because respect was not a small thing. It was the foundation of every home, every family, And if that foundation was gone, nothing else mattered. I began to prepare quietly, thinking of the way forward, knowing that the coming days would change everything between us forever. The cruelty came one evening, though I had seen signs before. I had begun to understand that disrespect was not something that fades quietly. It grows until it bursts into action. That night, the air in the house was heavy, though I did not know it yet. I had prepared myself for a quiet meal, hoping that peace might still be found between us. But I was wrong. The atmosphere was tense. Words were exchanged, sharp and cold. I tried to speak softly, but my words were met with interruption. It began as a disagreement, a simple difference of opinion. I suggested something at the table, not thinking it would matter so much, but my suggestion seemed to spark something deeper in my son and daughter. They were not merely disagreeing with me, they were dismissing me entirely. The tone in their voices was not of debate, but of derision. I felt the shift immediately. The room changed. The air thickened with hostility, and I began to sense that this would not end quietly. Then it happened. My son leaned forward, eyes burning with anger, and spat upon my face. The motion was deliberate, a clear act of insult. One spit was bad enough, but it did not end there. He spat again, and again, and again. I counted them in my mind, each one a silent blow to my dignity. 15 times in all, he spit upon me, each one a mark of contempt. His laughter echoed in the room, mingled with my daughter's mocking giggles. I stood silent, shocked beyond words. The plate before me lay untouched. The meal was forgotten. My breath came slow and heavy, not from hunger, but from humiliation. The others around the table seemed to watch as if this were some cruel entertainment. Their laughter grew louder, drowning out my presence. My body shook, not from cold, but from the sting of shame. 15 spits, each one more than an act of disrespect, each one a statement of disregard for everything I had given them. I did not retaliate in that moment. My years had taught me the strength of silence. I rose from my chair without a word. I stepped away from the table, leaving the meal, leaving my voice, leaving the laughter behind. I went into my room, closing the door softly behind me. The sound of laughter continued outside, but I no longer heard it. I was somewhere else entirely, somewhere deep inside where the pain had settled and began to turn into something colder, something more deliberate. That night, I lay awake. The sound of that laughter haunted me. I thought of the years I had sacrificed for them, of the warmth I had given without question. I thought of the meals I had skipped, the nights I had worked late so they could sleep in comfort. I thought of the trust I had placed in them and how easily they had shattered it. 15 spits were not just a humiliation. They were a declaration that they no longer valued me. That moment became etched into my memory. I reflected on the act again and again. It was not only disrespect, but a breaking of a sacred bond. I had not expected to be treated this way by my own child. The betrayal was sharper than any blow, deeper than any wound. That moment became a turning point. I knew silence alone could no longer be my answer. I realized I must act, quietly, legally, decisively. The cruelty had crossed a line that could not be ignored. I had to find a way to show them what their actions meant. That night was a night of quiet decision-making. I did not shout, nor did I speak. I sat with my thoughts. I thought about the lessons I had tried to teach them about respect, about love, about family. I thought about the home I had built for them, about the countless sacrifices I had made, and I thought about what justice might look like in such a moment. I knew it could not be anger. It could not be words. It had to be something that could not be undone. The cruel act was not a single moment. It was a culmination of years of disregard, but in that moment, I knew I had to turn it into a lesson they could not forget. I began to plan quietly, knowing that my next step would define what came after. The cruelty was a wound, but it was also a message, and I intended to answer it with a truth they could not ignore. I knew what I would do. It would be silent, yet unforgettable. It would not be a fight, but a declaration. From that night on, I carried a quiet resolve. Every laugh I heard in my absence, every conversation held without me, became fuel for my decision. The cruelty had been made clear, and my response would be equally clear. I would not react in haste or with anger. I would act with purpose and with the weight of my years of sacrifice behind me. That cruelty became the foundation of my decision, the moment when patience ended and justice began. That night, after the cruel act at dinner, I sat alone in my small room. The house was quiet now, but my mind was loud with thoughts. The laughter outside had faded, but the sound still echoed in my ears. I could feel my body still tense, my heart still heavy with the humiliation I had endured. The act was more than disrespect. It was a wound to the soul. I could not shake the memory of it. 15 spits, each one carrying its own weight of contempt. I thought about the years I had lived, the years I had given to my family. I remembered the nights I came home tired, the mornings I woke before anyone else. I remembered the cold winters I endured so they could have warmth, the empty plates I left for myself so theirs would be full. I remembered the times I worked in silence so they could live with comfort. My mind replayed every sacrifice I had made, every gift I had given, without asking for anything in return. That reflection brought me pain, but also clarity. I realized that respect is not given without trust. Respect must be earned and guarded. Yet, in that moment, I understood that I had given mine without reserve, and it had been met with disdain. The cruelty I endured was not a sudden incident. It was the product of years of being taken for granted, of having my voice dismissed quietly until the final act of mockery at the dinner table. I thought about my son, the way he had looked at me that night, not with anger or confusion, but with deliberate scorn. His laughter had not been of joy. It was the laughter of cruelty. My daughter had joined in, treating my humiliation as though it were entertainment. I wondered how they could forget so easily what I had done for them. How could they not remember that my hands built what they lived in, that my sweat paid for what they enjoyed? The sting of betrayal was sharper than the sting of the spits themselves. I sat quietly, looking at the chair at the head of the table where I had been spat upon. That chair had been mine for decades, a place of respect in our home. It was more than wood and cloth. It was a symbol of my place in the family. And yet, even before that night, it had been taken away in small ways. My opinions were ignored. My words were dismissed. My place at the table was questioned. And then, in one cruel act, it was stripped away completely. That chair was now empty of dignity, just like my own spirit had been that night. As I sat there, I thought of the long years I had given them without complaint. I thought of the nights I lay awake worrying about them, of the mornings I rose with determination to provide. I thought of how I had carried the weight of family without expecting thanks. But respect was not something that could be demanded, and in that moment I knew it could not be begged for either. Respect had to be taught, and my silence until then had not been the lesson I intended. The more I thought about it, the more I realized silence had become an ally of disrespect. My quiet endurance had given them permission to disregard me. My lack of confrontation had allowed them to grow careless in how they treated me. That night, my reflection became resolve. I would no longer stand in silence and let them define my worth. I would respond, not with anger or loud words, but with a decision that would speak louder than anything I could say. I thought about what kind of decision would have weight, that would make them understand what they had done. I knew it could not be a petty act, nor something that could be undone. It had to be something definitive, something that could not be erased by words or time. I thought about my life, about the sacrifices I had made, and I realized that the answer lay in action, in ownership, in the power I still held quietly. That night, I began to form the decision that would shape the rest of my life. My mind drifted between the past and the future. I thought of the years I had spent providing, of the love I had given unconditionally, of the pain of seeing that love dismissed. I thought of the act of cruelty as both a wound and a signal that my patience had run its course. I realized that respect could not be restored with apologies or words alone. It would take something that could not be ignored. I decided then that my response would be deliberate, measured, and permanent. I lay in the quiet of the night, letting my thoughts settle. I did not feel anger now. I felt clarity. I understood that this moment of reflection was the turning point. I would no longer allow my silence to be mistaken for weakness. I would take what I had built, what I had given, and use it to teach the lesson they had refused to learn. That night, the seeds of my decision were sown. I knew exactly what my next step would be. The next morning, I woke with a quiet determination. The memory of the cruelty from the night before had settled deep into my bones. I knew the path ahead would not be easy, but I also knew it had to be taken. My mind was no longer clouded with confusion or hurt. It was sharp with resolve. I decided I would no longer stand by in silence. I would respond, not in haste, but in a way that carried weight. This was not about revenge born of anger. It was about reclaiming my dignity and teaching a lasting lesson. First, I needed clarity. I could not act without knowing the extent of my rights and the best way to carry out my decision. I began by gathering the papers that mattered most, the deeds, the ownership documents, the records I had kept for years. Each paper was a reminder of my labor, my sacrifices, my years spent building and preserving what we lived in. I studied them with careful attention, ensuring I understood what they meant. The legal weight of those papers became a quiet comfort to me. They were my shield and my answer. I made a call to a lawyer I had trusted for decades, someone who knew me and understood the quiet nature of my life. I explained what had happened, my reasons, and the direction I was leaning toward. The lawyer listened without interruption, then spoke with careful words. He told me of my legal rights, the procedures I could take, and the consequences. He confirmed what I suspected. I had the authority to take action quietly, without unnecessary confrontation, and without giving them the chance to undo it. That knowledge settled in me like steel. The lawyer's confirmation was not a victory yet. It was a tool. I knew that the real work lay ahead. This was not merely about legal ownership. It was about delivering a lesson that could not be ignored. I thought deeply about how to proceed. I considered confrontation, shouting, demanding apologies, but I knew those would only give them the satisfaction of a reaction. My decision had to be quieter, sharper, and more permanent. It had to be an act that would speak louder than words ever could. I decided on the course of action that would leave no doubt in their minds about my resolve. I would sell the house quietly, legally, and without warning. It would be my final statement, a response measured in silence but heard loudly. I wanted them to feel the weight of what they had done without me needing to raise my voice. This was not an act of anger, but an act of finality. I wanted it to stand as proof that disrespect could not be tolerated and that dignity required action. Before proceeding, I took time to prepare myself emotionally. I knew this would not be easy. Selling the house meant more than transferring ownership. It meant severing ties, closing a chapter of my life built on decades of work and love. But I told myself that the chapter had been closed the moment I was locked in that bathroom. The house had become a place of cruelty, and my connection to it had been poisoned. Selling it would be my liberation as much as my message. I also considered the risks. There would be backlash, questions, anger. My son might come after me in anger, family ties might break further. But I understood that this decision was not for them. It was for me. It was the reclaiming of my life and dignity. I could not live in a place where my presence was treated as a burden and my voice silenced. I had to act in a way that aligned with my own values, not theirs. That clarity gave me courage. Finally, I resolved to move forward quietly and decisively. I instructed my lawyer to handle everything with discretion. No announcements, no confrontations, no opportunity for them to bargain or plead. I would let the action speak for itself. This was not a drama to be played out in the open. It was a lesson to be delivered with the quiet certainty of truth. I closed my eyes and let the weight of my decision settle. It was not easy, but it was necessary. I was ready to take the next step. The decision was no longer a burden, but a release. I felt lighter, as though a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. The path ahead was clear. I knew that once this was done, my life would change forever. I would no longer be the man who tolerated disrespect in silence. I would be the man who acted when silence was no longer enough. I was ready to turn my reflection into action, to let the lesson of my dignity be told without words. This was my decision, my moment, my peace. I began the process quietly, without telling anyone of my decision. There was no rush, only steady resolve. I knew that discretion was part of the strength of my choice. My lawyer worked methodically, preparing everything with precision. Ownership papers, legal documents, transfer records, every detail was handled with care. I watched as the work unfolded quietly in the background, without drama, without noise. It was important to me that no one would sense what was coming until the moment it was done. The first step was finding the right buyer. I needed someone who would respect the property and take it without unnecessary questioning. I did not want the sale to be delayed or contested. My lawyer connected me with a trustworthy buyer who understood the process and valued efficiency over bargaining. The buyer visited the property quietly, saw the house, and agreed to purchase it without fuss. Their interest was simple, respectful, and fast. I saw in that transaction the quiet justice I was seeking. The day we signed the papers was a calm one. I arrived at the lawyer's office with no grand gestures, no announcements. Everything was handled professionally, quietly, as if it were nothing extraordinary. But to me, it was everything. Each signature was a step away from the pain I had endured and a step toward the freedom I had sought. When the last document was signed, the transaction was complete. The house was no longer mine, and that was exactly what I wanted. I had given them silence, but I had also given them a lesson that could not be erased. I thought about how they would react when they discovered the change. I knew there would be shock. I knew there would be anger and disbelief. But I wanted them to feel the full weight of what they had done before I spoke a word. The sale was not about money. It was about principle. It was about proving that disrespect could never be tolerated. That lesson had to stand without my voice, without argument. The paper was the voice. The signature was the truth. When all the formalities were complete, I took a moment to reflect. I thought of the years I had spent building a life for my family, the sacrifices I had made without complaint. I thought of the nights spent working so my children could sleep warm, the days of toil and endurance. And I thought of the moment my dignity was stripped away, locked in a bathroom, abandoned. Selling the house was my way of reclaiming the years I had given without expectation. It was the final proof that my life and dignity mattered. Before leaving the lawyer's office, I left clear instructions. No one was to speak of the sale until I decided it was time. I wanted this to be a quiet truth, discovered in its own time. There would be no grand reveal, no public confrontation. I wanted the act to speak, not me. This was my revenge, not through noise or chaos, but through quiet finality. The decision was mine, and I carried it with the steady heart of a man who knew he was right. Walking out of that office, I felt a strange peace. The weight that had been pressing on me for weeks seemed lighter. I was no longer a man trapped by cruelty, by disrespect, or by silence. I was a man who had acted, who had made a choice, and who had reclaimed his dignity. I knew that when they learned of the sale, they would be left without words, and that silence would be my answer. The sale was not just a transfer of property. It was a transfer of power back to me. The house, once a symbol of my sacrifice, was now a closed chapter. I had made the decision, I had acted quietly, and I had delivered my lesson without shouting. That was the essence of the choice I had made. Justice did not always need to be loud. Sometimes the quietest act was the strongest. I knew that in the days to come, the truth of what I had done would echo far louder than any argument I could have made. And with that thought, I stepped forward into the next chapter of my life, free of the weight that had held me down for so long. When the day came for me to speak, I chose a quiet moment. I did not gather the family in anger, nor did I demand attention. I waited until dinner, when everyone was present, and the air was still with conversation. I set my glass down slowly, placed the papers before them, and let my silence speak first. There was no rush, no shouting, only the calm of a man who had made his choice and was prepared to see it through. I knew the moment was mine to command without raising my voice. I began simply saying, "Your house is sold." The words landed in the room quietly, but with undeniable weight. My daughter looked up sharply, her laughter fading. My son froze mid-bite, unsure if he had heard me correctly. My voice did not tremble, for I had rehearsed nothing. I needed no argument. The papers lay between us, proof of my decision. No one could deny the truth when faced with signed documents. The silence that followed was heavier than any noise I could have made. They looked at the papers as though seeing them for the first time. My daughter's eyes widened, not with anger, but disbelief. My son's shoulders slumped, as if a weight had fallen from him and crushed him at the same time. I did not need to speak further. The documents spoke louder than words. Every clause, every signature, every date was a testament to the reality I had created. I knew they would read it over and over, searching for a flaw, a loophole, a mistake that would undo what I had done. There was none. For me, that moment was not about victory. It was about closure. The years of sacrifice, the nights of pain, and the days of endurance had led to this quiet reckoning. I had endured cruelty, silence, and disrespect without retaliation. But now, I had acted in the only way that would truly be understood. Selling her house was not revenge in noise, but in permanence. It was a lesson written in ink, legal and undeniable. No words could erase it. My son finally spoke, his voice low and uncertain. He asked why, though I had already given him the answer through my action. I simply said nothing more. My silence was louder than any explanation. I did not need to defend myself. The truth was there for them to face. They could interpret it as they wished, but the facts remained. The sale was complete. The house was no longer theirs, and I was no longer bound to their cruelty. I saw the change in their expressions. My daughter's pride faltered, replaced by confusion and shame. My son's defiance disappeared, replaced by regret he could not hide. Around the table, conversation stopped. Neighbors and family members alike looked on in silence, sensing the gravity of what had just happened. No one spoke, for there was no need. The moment had spoken for itself. I had given them my answer without raising my voice. That night, I left quietly. I did not shout or demand apologies. I did not wait for forgiveness. I walked away with the calm certainty that I had done what was right for myself. I knew they would talk about it long after I was gone. They would whisper about the day I revealed my decision. But I also knew they would never forget it. That was my victory, not in confrontation, but in the quiet certainty of having acted with justice. I left, carrying nothing but the peace of a man who had closed a chapter. The day after I revealed my decision, the air around our home was heavy. The silence was different now. It was no longer the quiet of respect or peace, but the silence of shock and unspoken words. Neighbors walked past with lowered eyes. Whispers began to form in the streets. Friends and relatives approached quietly, offering soft words that carried more sympathy for me than understanding for what had happened. The news of the sale spread faster than I had imagined, becoming the talk of the neighborhood by evening. I stayed away from the crowd. I did not wish to watch the spectacle of my own life played out as gossip. Yet, through the windows, I could feel the tension. My daughter did not speak to me, and my son avoided my eyes entirely. At the table the night before, the conversation had stopped abruptly. No one could meet the silence I left behind, nor could they undo it. The papers on the table remained, their weight heavier than any argument we might have had. That silence was a punishment far greater than any word or shout could have been. My son wandered through the house as if searching for something lost. He opened cupboards, touched the walls, and stared at the rooms as though they held answers. But there was nothing left for him to claim. The house he had once called his home was no longer his. He could not reverse the decision. The documents were final, the signatures permanent. The ownership changed. I had acted quietly, without noise, but my actions spoke with a lasting voice. This was my lesson to them. a lesson in respect and consequence that could not be ignored. I heard my daughter speaking to neighbors outside, her voice low and trembling. She spoke of betrayal, of injustice, of a father who had taken from his own child. But they spoke too of cruelty, of words spoken without care, of a life of disrespect that had led to this moment. Some sided with her, some with me. It did not matter. The truth was not in their words, but in what had been done. My action could not be undone. It was a quiet, final statement that carried more weight than any conversation could. The house grew quieter. My son stopped speaking altogether. He moved through it as a ghost moves through walls, visible but silent. Relatives avoided visiting, unsure whether to speak or to watch in silence. My daughter's face became a mask of regret, her laughter replaced by a quiet bitterness. She did not call me. She did not attempt to change my mind. My absence was complete. The house, once full of life and noise, became a place of stillness and reflection. I had left without confrontation, but my leaving left a scar they would carry forever. I heard later that they tried to reverse the sale. Lawyers were consulted. Friends offered advice. Yet nothing could change the fact that I had acted within my rights. Every document had been prepared with care, every step taken with precision. The law stood with me. I stood with my decision. The house had been more than a building. It had been a symbol of respect, of care, of sacrifice. When that respect was denied, the home could no longer stand in its place. I had given them proof of what happens when respect is lost. The neighbors watched quietly as the days passed. Some nodded in quiet approval when they saw me walking away. Others shook their heads in disapproval. But I had stopped caring about opinions. What mattered was that I had reclaimed my dignity. I had acted not out of hate, but out of self-respect. I had closed the door on cruelty and opened a new chapter for myself. The fallout was theirs to live with. My peace was my own, and no words could take it away. I had spoken in silence, and silence had been my final victory. After the storm of silence settled, I knew my place in that home was no longer mine. The walls that had once held laughter now carried echoes of arguments, the air heavy with unspoken words. I walked through rooms that no longer welcomed me, touched objects that no longer held warmth. My peace had been shattered by betrayal, but I had rebuilt it quietly with my own hands. I began to plan an escape, not out of anger, but out of necessity. This was not just a leaving, it was a reclaiming of my life. I had given years, sweat, and love, only to be repaid with disrespect. My escape would be my final statement. I chose a place far from the eyes of my son, far from whispers and judgments. I wanted a life untouched by their opinions. I wanted quiet. I wanted to breathe without remembering the night I was locked out. I searched for towns where no one knew me, where my past would be my own to carry in silence. The idea of starting anew became a comfort rather than a burden. I had learned that sometimes the greatest victory comes not from confrontation, but from walking away. My heart, once heavy with grief, now sought freedom. Finding the right place took weeks. I traveled quietly, without announcement, without the need for witnesses. The world felt larger when you carry no ties, and I found myself breathing deeper in places I had never seen. Each step away from the home felt like shedding layers of sorrow. I looked for a small cottage where the wind spoke softly and where the river flowed with gentle certainty. It was not about luxury, it was about peace. I wanted a place where my days could pass without pain, a place where the weight of betrayal would dissolve. I found it in a quiet village far from my past life. A small house by the river, painted in soft white, surrounded by wildflowers. It had a porch that looked over the water and windows that caught the morning sun. The air smelled of earth and freedom. I signed the papers quickly and without ceremony. No one was there to watch me leave. The world had become mine again. I carried with me only a small bag of belongings, memories, and a heart healed in quiet resolve. The house was mine, and so was my new life. The first night in my new home was filled with silence and a strange sense of relief. No echoes of arguments haunted me here. No doors were locked against me. The stars above seemed softer, the air kinder. I walked along the riverbank as the moon rose, feeling the frost of the past dissolve in the warmth of this new chapter. I realized my escape was not just from a home, but from a lifetime of being taken for granted. I had chosen dignity over resentment, peace over vengeance. My life was mine to shape again. Neighbors greeted me with quiet curiosity. They knew nothing of my past, and I told them nothing. My story was mine alone, and I carried it like a treasure locked away. I built a small garden, planted flowers, and let the seasons teach me patience. Each morning I woke to the sound of birds. Each evening I fell asleep to the whisper of the river. I learned to live without anger, and in that quiet, my soul healed. The weight I had carried for years began to lighten. I found peace not in possession, but in release. I never returned to the town I left. I knew that my presence would only reopen wounds. My son would have never understood my choice, and my daughter would have clung to pride instead of reflection. I had given them the final lesson in respect without raising my voice. My escape was my answer, and it was complete. I lived the rest of my days quietly, free from the chains of the past. I had sold the house, left the town, and in leaving, I had found my freedom. My escape was my victory. Now, as an old man, I tell this story quietly, without anger, without prideful boasting, only with the quiet knowledge that I did what I had to do. Life had taught me lessons I never thought I would need to learn so late. Respect is not given by blood alone. It must be earned, and sometimes it must be preserved by distance. I had given everything, and when it was not valued, I had to let go. My escape was not just physical, but spiritual. A reclaiming of myself that could never be taken away. The years had left me wise, if not untouched. I reflect on that night my son locked me away. I remember the cold, the fear, the humiliation. I remember the silence of the house when I banged on the door. Those nights were not just moments of cruelty, they were moments of clarity. I understood that love and respect must travel both ways. I understood that endurance has limits. I learned that there is a moment when silence becomes a decision, and a decision becomes liberation. My reflection now is a mixture of sadness and peace. I mourn what was lost, but I cherish what I have gained. In my years of solitude, I have thought often about revenge and justice. They are not the same thing. Revenge burns quickly and leaves scars. Justice is quiet, lasting, and often invisible. My revenge was quiet. It was the selling of the house, the leaving of the country, the closing of a chapter. It was letting my absence speak louder than my voice. I never sought confrontation because confrontation leaves wounds that can never heal. My choice was final and deliberate. I let my life be the answer. I let my peace be the answer. Now I wake each morning to the sound of water moving over stones, the soft rustle of trees, the song of birds I have never named. I walk slowly along the riverbank, letting the cold air fill my lungs. I have no regrets for the choices I made, because I have learned that dignity is worth more than possession. My heart no longer carries bitterness. My thoughts no longer return to the locked bathroom, the cruel laughter, the words that cut deeper than any blade. I live now in a place where silence is peace, and peace is enough. Sometimes I wonder if my son ever thought of me, if he ever understood why I left. I think he might have, if he had been willing to listen. But he was not ready then. He was not ready to see the truth of respect, of family, of what is owed. My leaving was my final lesson to him, that you cannot force respect, that you cannot demand love, that sometimes the best answer is to step away. I chose to leave quietly, not to destroy, but to preserve myself. I chose freedom over conflict. I chose peace over pain. In the quiet of my new life, I have learned something profound. The greatest revenge is not to harm, but to heal. To take back what was lost is not always about reclaiming property or pride. It is about reclaiming your own heart, your own peace, your own life. I have walked away from a home, a family, a life that no longer valued me. I have walked toward a life that belongs to me alone. That is the kind of justice that stays with you forever. I have found it now. My reflection as an old man is this: cruelty teaches us what we cannot ignore. Silence teaches us what we must act on. Leaving teaches us that life is not about what we lose, but about what we choose to keep. I keep my dignity. I keep my peace. I keep my heart open to the life I have chosen. My story is not one of bitterness, but of quiet strength. My son locked me away for 3 nights, but I unlocked a life for myself that no one could take. That is my truth. That is my peace. My final thought, spoken softly to the wind that carries my years, is this: he locked me in a bathroom for 3 nights. I locked my life away from him forever. And in that locking, I found my freedom, my dignity, my escape. I never looked back, and I never regretted it. The house I sold was not just brick and mortar. It was a chapter of a life I had to close to open a new one. I left behind a past filled with pain to walk into a future filled with peace, and that is my greatest victory.